There are places in America where winter doesn't just arrive, it descends. It falls like a curtain being drawn over the entire world, heavy and absolute, cutting off roads, silencing valleys, and burying everything familiar beneath feet of snow that won't melt for months. And somewhere inside those long, aching winters, deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, families gathered around fires they couldn't afford to let go out. And they cooked. They cooked with almost nothing. They cooked with what they had dried in August, smoked in October, salted in September, and prayed over in November. They cooked meals that had no names in any cookbook, no place in any restaurant, no history in any archive, just the quiet inheritance of a people who had learned through generations of hardship that survival and flavor are not opposites. This is not a story about poverty, though poverty was certainly there. It's a story about ingenuity, about the particular kind of creativity that blooms only when there is no other choice, about the women who stood at wood stoves in the gray light of January mornings and transformed cornmeal, dried beans, and a heel of cured pork into something their families would eat with gratitude. About the men who came in from the cold with a squirrel or a handful of dried mushrooms and handed them over like they were gold. Because in those mountains, in those winters, they were. The Appalachian Range runs for nearly 2,000 miles along the spine of eastern North America, from Alabama all the way up into Canada. But when people talk about Appalachian culture, about the hollows and the hardship and the particular way of living that developed there, they're usually talking about the central and southern stretches, eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, western North Carolina, West Virginia, and the remote corners of Tennessee. These were places where European settlers, many of them Scots-Irish immigrants who had already known displacement and poverty in their home countries, arrived in the 1700s and found themselves confronted with some of the most rugged, isolating terrain on the continent. There were no flat expanses for easy farming. The soil on the steep mountain slopes leached nutrients quickly. The growing season was shorter than in the valleys below. Rivers flooded without warning. And in winter, the mountains had a way of closing in on themselves, trapping communities in a silence so complete that the nearest neighbor's chimney smoke, visible from miles away across a white valley, could feel like the only proof that the rest of the world still existed. By the mid-1800s, many of these communities were so geographically isolated that their residents had never seen a railroad, never visited a town with more than a few hundred people, and lived almost entirely on what they could produce themselves, not by choice, by circumstance. The Great Depression, when it arrived in the late 1920s and early 1930s, did not hit Appalachia the way it hit other parts of America. It couldn't. There was no stock market wealth to lose, no bank savings to evaporate. What the Depression brought to these mountains was something subtler and more insidious. It brought a collapse of the small cash economy that had been slowly, tentatively developing. The mines closed or reduced wages. The logging companies pulled out. The little bit of cash that mountain families used to buy salt, coffee, and occasionally cloth, that dried up. And so they fell back entirely on what they had always half relied on: the land, the smokehouse, the root cellar, and the knowledge in their hands. It is impossible to understand what Appalachian families ate without understanding what they feared. They feared February most. February was the month when the root cellar's shelves, stocked so carefully the previous autumn, began to look dangerously bare. When the dried beans at the bottom of the barrel started to feel like a countdown. When the last shoulder of smoked pork hanging from the smokehouse rafter began to be rationed in paper-thin slices. January, you could still feel the abundance of fall. March, you could start to hope for spring. But February had nothing to offer except cold and hunger. And the meals that Appalachian families cooked in February were the truest test of everything they knew. The first and most fundamental thing to understand about Appalachian cooking in its traditional form is that it was built on 4 pillars: corn, pork, beans, and whatever the wild land offered. Everything else, the potatoes, The dried squash, the sorghum, the canned tomatoes, the forage greens. Those were critical supplements, life-saving additions, but they existed in orbit around those four central elements. A family that had cornmeal, a side of cured pork, and dried beans in the cellar could probably survive the winter. Whether they survived well, whether they had enough energy to split wood and tend animals and haul water and do all the other work that winter demanded, that depended on how cleverly they stretched those stores. Cornmeal was the great constant. Corn had been grown in these mountains for generations before European settlement, cultivated by Cherokee and other indigenous peoples who had developed varieties specifically suited to the shorter growing seasons of higher elevations. The settlers adopted it quickly and completely, and by the 19th century, corn, in its many forms, underpinned almost every meal in the Appalachian kitchen. Cornbread, cooked in a cast iron skillet that had been heating on the wood stove since before dawn, was the daily bread. Not the sweet, cakey cornbread that most Americans know today. Traditional Appalachian cornbread was made with stone-ground cornmeal, water or buttermilk, a little salt, sometimes an egg, and grease, whatever fat was available, rendered lard being the most common. And it was cooked hot and fast, developing a dark, crackling crust on the bottom and sides while the interior set into something dense and satisfying and faintly smoky from the iron. A single skillet of cornbread could feed a family at 2 meals, and it required almost nothing to make. But cornmeal could be shaped into other things too. And in a winter kitchen, variety mattered. Not just for morale, though morale mattered more than people give it credit for when the days are short and the cold is relentless. But also because different preparations extracted different things from the same ingredient. Cornmeal mush, for instance, was made by simmering cornmeal slowly in water until it thickened into something like porridge. It could be eaten hot in the morning, sweetened with a spoonful of sorghum or honey if there was any, and then the leftover mush, poured into a pan and allowed to cool and solidify overnight, could be sliced and fried in grease the next day. A preparation sometimes called fried mush or cornmeal griddle cakes, and served with more sorghum or with whatever was available. One batch of cornmeal mush made 2 different meals from the same simple ingredients, and that kind of resourcefulness was not a trick or a novelty. It was a necessity so ingrained that people didn't even think of it as clever. It was simply how things were done. Dried beans were the protein that kept Appalachian families alive through winters when meat ran low. There were many varieties: October beans, which the Cherokee had been growing for centuries, and which took their name from the month they were typically harvested and dried. White half-runner beans, which climbed up corn stalks in the summer gardens. Soup beans, a general term that usually referred to pinto beans, which became the dominant bean variety across much of Appalachia in the 20th century. Beans were planted in spring, tended through summer, and then in the fall, before the first hard frost, the dry pods were pulled from the vines, shelled, and the hard little seeds spread on newspaper or clean cloth to finish drying completely before being stored in cloth sacks or crockery. A good bean harvest could fill a cellar corner with enough protein to last all winter, and families knew it. The classic preparation was the simplest: beans and salt pork, or beans and a ham hock, simmered together in a heavy pot for hours on the back of the wood stove. The beans absorbed the smoky, salty, faintly funky depth of the cured pork and released their own starchy richness into the broth, creating something that was more than either ingredient alone. This was soup beans, sometimes called leather britches soup when the beans used were those that had been strung on thread and hung to dry whole in their pods. A Cherokee preservation technique that Appalachian settlers adopted and never gave up. Leather britches beans, dried this way, took even longer to cook than shelled dried beans, and they had a distinctive chewy, almost woody texture that divided opinion. Some people found it off-putting. Others swore it was superior to any other preparation. What both groups agreed on was that a pot of beans simmering all day on a cold winter morning filled a house with a smell that was, without exaggeration, one of the great comforts of the season. Pork was the meat of Appalachian life, And this was no accident. Pigs were the ideal mountain livestock. They were self-sufficient foragers, capable of finding a significant portion of their own food in the forest, eating acorns, chestnuts, roots, and whatever else the woods offered. They required less flat pasture land than cattle. They converted almost every part of themselves into usable food, and they could be processed, slaughtered, butchered, salted, smoked, and stored without refrigeration, which was obviously critical in an era before electricity reached the mountains. Hog Killing Day was one of the great rituals of the Appalachian year, typically taking place in late November or December when the temperatures had dropped enough to prevent the meat from spoiling during processing. But before the hardest winter cold made working outside unbearable, it was a community event. Neighbors helped neighbors because the work was too much for a single family. And because helping meant you would be helped in return. The entire animal was used. The hams and shoulders were rubbed with salt and sometimes sugar and pepper, wrapped in cloth, and hung in the smokehouse. The bacon sides were cured. The fat back, the thick layer of pure fat from the back, was rendered into lard, which would be the primary cooking fat for the entire winter. The organ meats and trimmings that wouldn't keep, the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the tongue, were cooked immediately, and Hog Killing Day became, paradoxically, one of the most abundant eating days of the year, a brief feast before the long lean months ahead. What remained of the pig after the prime cuts were cured went into forms that could be used through the winter. The head was simmered for hours to extract every bit of meat, which was then mixed with the cooking broth and seasonings and poured into pans to cool and solidify into souse meat, sometimes called head cheese, a jellied preparation that could be sliced and eaten cold or fried in a skillet. The feet were pickled in vinegar brine. The cracklins, the crisp, golden, intensely flavored bits of skin and fat left over after lard rendering, were eaten as a snack, crumbled into cornbread batter to make cracklin bread, or saved to add flavor to other dishes. Even the intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausage. Nothing was wasted. In a mountain winter, waste was a form of suicide. The woods and the fields, even in winter, offered things that a careful eye could find. Dried mushrooms were one of the great secret weapons of the Appalachian winter kitchen. Mushrooms, dried chestnut mushrooms, oyster mushrooms gathered from fallen logs, and many other varieties had been foraged in the fall and strung up in the dry warmth near the stove to dehydrate completely. In winter, these shriveled, leathery fragments were reconstituted in a little warm water and then added to soups, gravies, and bean dishes, where they released an intense, earthy savoriness, what food scientists now call umami, that transformed a thin broth into something deeply satisfying. The soaking water itself, which absorbed the mushroom's flavor, was never discarded. It went into the pot. Dried pumpkin and squash were another essential. Hard winter squash, butternut, Hubbard, the various heirloom varieties that mountain families had maintained for generations, stored well in a root cellar for months, but the dried forms were lighter and took up less space. Thin slices of pumpkin, dried on strings or on flat surfaces near the fire until they were leathery and brittle, could be stored in cloth sacks and then reconstituted in winter to make pumpkin soup, pumpkin butter, or simply stewed pumpkin seasoned with whatever spices were available. Families who had sorghum, the thick, dark, mineral-rich syrup made from sorghum cane, which had largely replaced expensive imported sugar in Appalachian cooking, might sweeten the stewed pumpkin and eat it as a dessert or a sweet side dish. It tasted nothing like pumpkin pie from a can. It tasted like something that had been grown and saved and made with hands that knew what they were doing. Potatoes had arrived in Appalachian gardens by the early 19th century, and they became a vital part of the winter diet because they stored well in cold root cellars, ideally between 35 and 40 degrees, the temperature that slowed their respiration and kept them from either freezing or rotting. And because they were filling, calorie-dense, and extraordinarily versatile. Fried potatoes, cooked in lard or bacon grease with salt and sometimes dried onion, appeared at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Potato soup, made with nothing more than potatoes simmered in water with salt pork, and perhaps some dried onion or wild ramps, then mashed partly or wholly into the broth, was a staple of the coldest months. A more refined version might have a little milk or cream stirred in at the end, if the cow was still giving. And this version, creamy, smoky, warming, was the kind of meal that people remembered for the rest of their lives as the thing they most wanted when they were cold, or sick, or far from home. Ramps were one of the great culinary gifts of the Appalachian spring, but they also played a role in the winter diet through preservation. The wild leek, Allium tricoccum, to use the Latin name that no one in the mountains ever used, grew in dense carpet-like colonies on north-facing slopes and in rich hardwood hollows, emerging in late March and early April as one of the first green things to appear after the snow. Their smell was extraordinary, a powerful, penetrating blend of garlic and onion so strong that a person who had eaten ramps could clear a room hours later. And this was well known and sometimes celebrated, and sometimes merely accepted as the price of early spring food. Mountain communities pickled ramps in vinegar and salt, and these pickled ramps could be eaten through winter, stirred into beans or soup, or eaten alongside cornbread as a sharp, pungent condiment that cut through the heaviness of a diet built largely on pork fat and starch. Wild greens, even in winter, were sometimes available to those who knew where to look. In mild years, or in sheltered south-facing hollows where the snow didn't accumulate as deeply, watercress still grew along cold streams. In early spring, which in the mountains didn't feel much different from late winter, dandelion greens emerged from the thawing ground, bitter and bright, and almost impossibly welcome after months of dried and preserved foods. These were cooked in the traditional Appalachian way, wilted in hot bacon grease with a splash of vinegar and salt, the grease and vinegar and the heat transforming the bitterness into something complex and addictive, and the resulting dish called killed lettuce or wilted greens, being one of the great expressions of Appalachian cooking's fundamental logic. Take the simplest thing available and use fat and acid and heat to make it into something worth eating. There is a preparation called stack cake that serves as a kind of archive of Appalachian culinary ingenuity, and it deserves particular attention not because it was a common everyday food. It was not. It was a special occasion dish made for weddings and large gatherings. But because it encapsulates so perfectly the philosophy that animated everything in the mountain kitchen. Stack cake is made from thin layers of a barely sweet, almost gingerbread-like cake, traditionally cooked in a skillet rather than baked because not everyone had an oven, stacked with dried apple filling between each layer. The dried apples, which had been peeled and sliced thin and laid out on clean cloths in the September sun, or strung on thread and hung near the stove, were reconstituted and cooked with spices into a thick, dark, intensely flavorful paste. The layers were assembled and then left, typically overnight, for the moisture from the filling to soften and meld with the cake layers, transforming the whole thing from a stack of dry discs and thick paste into a unified, tender, deeply flavored cake. The longer it sat, the better it got. It was a dish that rewarded patience. And in the mountains, patience, the patience to preserve in summer for winter, to wait out the snow, to let things take their time, was not a virtue. It was a survival skill. Salt was everything. Salt was the technology that made almost all of the other preservation methods possible. Without salt, the hams in the smokehouse would rot. Without salt, the beans in the pot would taste like boiled cardboard. Without salt, the pickled vegetables in their crocks would ferment into something inedible or dangerous. And salt was one of the few things that mountain families had to buy. They could not make it themselves, which made the spring salt lick, where deer and other animals gathered to lick mineral-rich seeps from the earth. Not just a hunting spot, but a reminder of what lay beyond their ability to produce. Before the mid-1800s, some families used wood ash, lye leached through hickory ash as a salt substitute in certain preparations, most notably in the process of making hominy. dried corn treated with an alkaline solution, a process that the Cherokee had been using for centuries and that the settlers learned from them. A process that modern food scientists now understand dramatically increases the nutritional value of the corn by making its niacin available to the human body. The people who ate hominy didn't know about niacin. They knew that hominy was filling and good, that it could be dried and stored and cooked in many ways, that it was better than plain corn in a way they couldn't quite articulate. They were right, in ways they couldn't have known. Buttermilk was a byproduct of butter making, which was itself a product of having a milk cow through the winter, something not every family had. Families that did have milk cows occupied a somewhat better position than those that didn't, because milk and its derivatives, buttermilk, butter, cheese, cream, added fat, protein, and variety to a diet that could otherwise become monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Buttermilk was used in cornbread and biscuits, and it had a pleasant, mild tang that enriched everything it touched. It was also drunk straight, cold from the spring house. And in summer, this was one of the great pleasures of farm life. In winter, cold from the cellar, it was more necessity than pleasure, but it was sustaining. Families who made cheese, pressing the curds of soured milk into firm rounds wrapped in cloth and aged in the cellar, had a source of concentrated protein and fat that could last for months if properly maintained, and a good, aged mountain cheese, with its sharp, crumbling texture and concentrated tang, was something that people ate with cornbread and considered themselves lucky. Sourwood honey, gathered in the late summer from the sourwood trees that bloomed throughout the Appalachian range, was another luxury that some families had and some didn't. Those who kept bees had a sweetener that lasted indefinitely. Honey, properly stored, does not spoil. And this was used sparingly through the winter to sweeten cornmeal mush, to preserve fruits in honey rather than sugar syrup, and occasionally to make a simple sweet bread that was more celebration than sustenance. Sourwood honey has a distinctive floral, almost anise-like flavor that is different from any other honey, and those who grew up tasting it carried the memory of it their entire lives. Persimmons, which were native to the Appalachian region and grew in the edges of clearings and along fence rows, were one of the great underappreciated wild foods of the mountains. Before a frost, wild persimmons are mouth-puckeringly astringent, full of tannins that make eating them an unpleasant experience. But after the first hard frost, and sometimes it took 2 or 3, the tannins break down and the persimmons become something entirely different. Sweet, almost custardy, with a complex flavor that has hints of brown sugar and apricot and something entirely their own. Mountain families gathered persimmons after the first frosts of fall, and the ones they didn't eat immediately were dried or made into persimmon pudding, a dense, dark, moist-baked good that was more like a steamed pudding than a cake, or persimmon beer, which was sometimes made and sometimes not, depending on the family's inclinations. Chess pie is another entry in the archive of Appalachian ingenuity, though its origins are contested and its history traveled from the plantation kitchens of the lowland South into the mountains. What matters for this story is what chess pie represented in the mountain kitchen, a way to make something that felt like abundance from almost nothing. The basic chess pie filling is eggs, sugar, or sorghum, butter, and a little cornmeal to help it set. That's it. Baked in a simple lard crust pastry shell, it produces something golden and sweet and impossibly rich tasting for how little it actually contains. In a world where butter and eggs and sweeteners were precious, chess pie was made for occasions, for visitors, for Sunday, for after a difficult week. It was a form of hospitality encoded into food, a way of saying to whoever was sitting at your table that they were worth the butter, worth the eggs, worth the sugar. Shucky beans, another name for leather britches, the whole dried beans strung on thread, have a history in Appalachian cooking that reaches back well before European settlement. The word shucky refers to the shucks, the pods, and the preparation involves stringing beans whole on a needle and heavy thread and hanging them in a warm, dry place, near the stove, in the attic, on the porch in dry weather, until they have dried completely. This takes weeks. The result is a dry, twisted, almost mummified version of the original bean. And when these are simmered in water for a very long time with salt pork, they release their flavor slowly and develop a distinctive texture. Tender but slightly chewy, with an earthy depth that is unlike any other bean preparation. Families who kept shucky beans through the winter had a food that connected them backward through time, through their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, through all the winter kitchens that had come before. Wild game was important, but was never guaranteed. Squirrel was the most common small game taken in the winter mountains, and it appeared in stews, fried in a skillet, or added to dumplings. Squirrel and dumplings. The squirrel simmered until the meat fell off the bone, the broth enriched with salt pork, and then thick dumplings of flour and lard and buttermilk dropped into the simmering liquid, was a complete meal in a single pot, warming and filling and flavored with whatever herbs were available, usually dried sage or wild thyme gathered in the summer and hung to dry near the stove. Rabbit was similarly prepared. Venison, when a deer was taken, and deer were less common in the 19th century, heavily hunted down from their earlier abundance, was treated with the same reverence as pork, smoked, or salted, or dried into jerky for long keeping. Wild turkey was another occasional prize, particularly in the fall before winter set in. The turkey, being a large bird, represented a rare abundance in the mountain diet, and it was treated accordingly. A whole turkey might be roasted directly in front of the fire on a spit. Few mountain kitchens had ovens large enough or hot enough for a full turkey. Turned slowly for hours, while the fat dripped into a pan below and was saved for other uses. The leftovers, if there were any, went into soups and stews over the following days. Every bit of meat stripped from the carcass, and then the bones themselves were simmered for a rich broth that would be the base of something else entirely. Sorghum molasses, produced in autumn from the sweet juice pressed from sorghum cane stalks and cooked down in large shallow pans over open fires, was the mountain sweetener. It was thick and dark and intensely flavored, with a mineral bitterness that distinguished it from the lighter sweetness of cane sugar. And it flavored everything from cornbread to gingerbread to the simple preparation called sorghum and butter, which was exactly what it sounds like. A small plate of sorghum with a pat of butter stirred into it, eaten with cornbread by dunking, and which tasted like something that needed no explanation and no improvement. Sorghum was also used medicinally. A spoonful of sorghum was given for sore throats, and its iron and potassium content, though unknown to those who used it, provided real nutritional value in a diet that could become depleted of minerals through the winter months. There are people alive today, though fewer every year, who remember eating these foods not as a recreation or a nostalgic exercise, but as the way things simply were. Grandmothers who learned to string beans from their grandmothers, who learned from theirs. Men who remember the smell of hog killing day, the sound of cornmeal being ground at the local mill, the way a pot of beans smelled when it had been cooking since morning. These living connections to the food tradition are ending one by one. And when they are gone, what remains will be written accounts and museum exhibits and occasional revival projects. Not the same thing. Never quite the same thing. What Appalachian families in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina and the hollows of West Virginia discovered through generations of necessity was that scarcity doesn't have to mean deprivation. It can mean ingenuity. It can mean an extraordinary closeness to the materials of survival, to the weight of dried beans in your hand, to the smell of smoke from the curing house, to the particular satisfaction of a cornbread skillet lifted from the stove on a cold morning. They discovered that flavor does not require abundance, that patience and skill and knowledge can create something worth eating from almost nothing, and that the knowledge of how to do this, built up over generations and passed hand to hand, season to season, through demonstration and necessity and repetition, was itself a kind of wealth that no economic collapse could entirely destroy. Today, these mountains have electricity and highways and supermarkets. The root cellars are mostly empty, or used for storage, or collapsed and grown over. The smokehouses are gone in most places, or standing as curiosities, their rafters holding nothing. The knowledge of how to make leather britches, how to render lard, how to cure a ham, how to stack a stack cake, how to read the weather well enough to know when to get the last of the garden in before a killing frost. This knowledge is fading, not gone yet. Fading. And there is something in that fading that is worth sitting with, worth feeling the weight of, before we move on to the next thing. Somewhere in a hollow in western North Carolina, there is still a woman who puts up dried beans every September. Somewhere in eastern Kentucky, someone's great aunt still makes stack cake for the holidays, layering the thin skillet cakes with cooked dried apple filling the way her grandmother taught her, leaving it overnight for the layers to soften, slicing it the next day with the quiet satisfaction of someone completing a task that has been completed in this way for a very long time. These things are still there, still alive, still being practiced by people who may not think of themselves as keepers of tradition, but who are unmistakably exactly that. The mountains are still there too. The winters still come. And somewhere in the bare pantry of understanding, in the growing awareness of how fragile supply chains are, how dependent we have become on systems we don't understand and can't repair, how far we have traveled from the knowledge of how to feed ourselves from what is at hand, the wisdom of those winter kitchens is still relevant, not as nostalgia, as instruction, because the families who survived those winters weren't surviving despite their poverty. They were surviving because of what they knew. And that is a distinction that matters more now than it might appear.